Hello, this is Ben, and today in this video we're going to talk about whether or not Christians should be in support of socialized healthcare or privatized healthcare. Essentially, what is a Christian view on the healthcare question? And the reason I want to bring this up is because surveys show that, we've talked about this in other videos, but people just get their ideas about how to live life from some other source than the Bible. And they think that the Bible doesn't really have anything to say about real life. And that's just not true. So let's just dig in. And the Bible's not going to tell you everything you need to know, but it gives you some very important guidelines. So let's just start with the first point I want to make for this video. And this could extend to other things, so these are very general points. But the first point I want to point out is that charity is a Christian virtue. In other words, helping those who can't help you, who haven't worked for it, who haven't earned it, is traditionally a virtuous, noble act according to Christianity. So the word grace comes from the same root as the word charity. The word grace just used to mean something more like charity, so you say grace. But you could say charity. So everywhere you read the word grace in your Bible, you could just put charity. In other words, the Greek is, let's see if I can do this right. The first letter is quite difficult. It's like a CH noise. You make an H from the back of the throat with a little C thrown in. It's not a C with an H, it's an H with a C. So it's like chi. So charitas. And that's like, it's the same thing on the word Christ. Christ, and you're like, what is that H doing there? Well, because originally it was Christos. Okay, Christos, something like that. So I'm struggling with it, but like, it's the Greek letter chi. Okay, so you could transliterate into English letters. You could say charity, or caritas is Charitos, and it means charity. Okay, and it also means grace. So anyway, so that's the first start. Let's look at some passages. Now, one of the most famous passages on the Christian concept of charity is in Matthew 25. At the end, Jesus talks about this final judgment, and he says, "But when the Son of Man comes in his glory, all the angels will be with him. He will sit on his glorious throne, and he's going to gather everyone. He will put the sheep on his right and his goats on his left." And then he's going to talk about, Jesus takes these people in and he says, "I was a stranger and you gave me something to eat, and you gave me something to drink, and you invited me in. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me." And they will say, "When did we see you hungry or feed you or thirsty and give you something to drink?" And Jesus says, "I say, to the extent that you did to one of these brothers of mine, even to the least of them, you did it to me." So Jesus equates helping the poorest and the weakest to helping him, which was a radical concept in the ancient world. No one thought that way. Jesus was the biggest and the awesomest. So doing stuff for Jesus was doing stuff for the biggest and the awesomest. So there was a radical transition definitive for Christianity, that Jesus equated doing things for the poorest and the weakest to doing things for him, to your devotion to the greatest and the mightiest. James is very blunt. So James chapter 2, this is sort of the famous part where he talks about faith and works, starting in verse 14. And, "What use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warm and be filled,' and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being itself. But someone may well say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works.' You believe that God is one, the demons also believe." And he goes into the point again. No, that was pretty much it. So, yeah, the Bible, those are two basic examples that as Christians, if you really want to follow Christ, then you have to help the needy. Charity is a virtue for Christianity. In fact, in the Middle Ages, courtly, chivalrous love was where they would often, knights would pledge, they would go do great deeds of charity in the honor of some royal woman who was married. in honor of how good of a Christian she is. So, and it was a big thing in the Middle Ages. Now, the issue with charity is, and I had an atheist kid hit me with this. He said Christians have been in charity, right? And so he was an atheist kid, and so he latched onto that. He's going to find a problem with charity, and therefore he can find a problem with Christianity. And so he was like, "Well, give me $5 right now." You know, and so he wanted to poke a hole in Christianity. He's saying that, you know, charity as a virtue, you can't just follow that. Because then, you know, you're going to have to do everything everyone says. And I'm going to have to give him all my money right now. He said, give me all your money right now, and you're not going to do it. And he wasn't trying to call me a hypocrite. He was just trying to point out that charity as a virtue makes no sense. Because he thought that would be a way to condemn Christianity. So, because I just know the kid. Not a good guy, but, like, he's just, you know, really die hard to, like, defeat Christianity. So, anyway, here's the thing. It's not love when it's not in someone's best interest. So to truly love someone is to will for the good of that person, to benevolence. Bene, good, volence, volition, will. So, like, benevolence. So what that means is, like, just because somebody wants something, it doesn't mean that you love them by doing it. I mean, if you, or an extreme example to make it obvious is if you ask me to gouge your eyes out, and if I do it, it's not really good for you, so it's not really loving. So love doesn't always mean doing what people ask you to do. That's important. But there is this question, this fundamental question, like, what do I do, like, with my money? Do I just, like, give it all away and just constantly give it all away? That doesn't really seem to make sense. I guess it would seem like a society that, I don't know, we won't worry about whether or not it makes sense because the Bible does talk about this. Another important biblical concept other than just charity is the concept of the family. So Jesus talks about this in Matthew 19 famously. And, you know, the Pharisees came to Jesus testing him and asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered them and said, have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And he's quoting Genesis 2 there. So I just point out this in Matthew 19 and in Genesis 2, so this is a very thorough biblical concept, the idea that God created the family unit. So you have a responsibility, unless you're going to be one of the people who, you know, stays unmarried. You know, and the Bible talks about that's a special role where you might be more devoted to spreading the kingdom of God, which is a great thing. But God set up a system in how humanity works, and you know, you would think like the people who need you the most would be, you know, your mother and father. But he says you have a responsibility when you get married to pull away from them and make your primary responsibility your wife, and then your own children until they grow up, and you know, theoretically they would have their own kids and pull away, and so that's how the system works. So like, the thing is, there's a division of responsibilities here. You are under your parents, you are connected to your parents until you get married, and then eventually you have your own kids and they'll be connected to you until they get married. And so how do we like I guess put the concept of charity with the concept of family together? And so the idea is that I have a God-given responsibility to make my family a top priority. And what seems to make the most obvious sense to me, you know, how to put these two together is like, but as much as I can, I help other people because that is a virtue. But I do not do that while disrespecting, you know, my God-given responsibility. So, in other words, you leave your father and your mother. It doesn't mean you don't care about your father and mother. You still care about them. You still help them. And so they essentially become someone outside of your primary responsibility, because now your new primary responsibility is to your husband or your wife. But that doesn't mean you don't care about them anymore. They'll always be your mother and they'll always be your father. And so I think that concept helps illustrate that yes, we still love you, but we do have to have a responsibility, you know, we are there for our own direct family first, and then everyone else as much as we can after we've taken care of them, if that makes sense. So I'm going to make sure my kids are well fed. I'm going to make sure my family's taken care of, and then if they're taken care of, then I take care of whoever else I can, because that is a Christian virtue. Okay, as best I can, because we always have limitations in this life. So that is important. That simple concept of, the concept that the Bible teaches a family responsibility of roles, that God created a family where you will separate from people who you are very close to so that you can be united to someone new, but at the same time charity is clearly a virtue. And so both those concepts are dual concepts within Christianity. And that really answers a lot of questions. Like, what about the immigration question? What about refugees from other countries? Absolutely, we want to help them as much as we can. We'll get into some other questions about this, but like the basic concept, as a Christian, would you want to help someone who is in need? Whether they're from another country, whether they're from your own country, or whatever. Hopefully, the concepts of family and the virtue of charity make that make sense. Okay, what would be a Christian perspective on that? So anyway, now the issue is that there is an added aspect of charity, and if we go back to the Old Testament actually says a lot about charity too, but it says a lot about opportunity, providing work for the poor that helps them. And so the whole system of slavery in the Old Testament was not really slavery. In fact, Deuteronomy, Exodus 20, I think verse 14, it's somewhere there, or it's 21. It says, you can't force someone to work for you. That's, you're supposed to be put to death for that. Okay, so the system of slavery it was something that was very common in the ancient world. People were much more poor then than they are now because they didn't have all this wonderful technology that we have. And so it's very common for people to say, I'm poor, I can't support myself. I'll do whatever you need if you just feed me. Okay. And so this became a system where people who had wealth would abuse others. Because, you'll do whatever I need? And then you wind up, just working for this guy, and he just becomes richer, and then he just gives you some scraps from his table and keeps you working for him. So the Jewish slave laws were created to keep abuses from happening within this system, but it turned the system into a system of helping the poor. The poor person was supposed to go free, and after a certain amount of time. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but also the important thing I want to point out here is that you essentially are providing the poor person with an opportunity. They're going to work, they're going to provide something, and when the way the system worked is the poor person got a lump sum of money beforehand, and that would help them pay off debts. Typically, they had borrowed from someone and to pay for the basic things of life, and then they had to wind up enslaving themselves to someone to pay off the debt. And so that rich guy would pay off the debt, and then you would work for that guy. So anyway, the point I wanted to make is that in Deuteronomy 15, it makes it very clear, if your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall set him free. When you set him free, you shall not send him, this is Deuteronomy 15, verse 12, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock, and from your threshing floor, and from your wine vat, and you shall give him as the Lord God has blessed you. And so, it's a simple concept in the Old Testament there, is like, you do charity, but you have to be careful about just giving people a handout. Instead of just, charity shouldn't be thought of just handing people money, handing people food, but also giving them opportunities to have their dignity, to ways to provide for themselves. So it's an important concept that's there in the Old Testament. The Old Testament law has a lot of giving handouts, but also at the same time giving opportunity for people to work and earn something. And so from a biblical perspective, and he even says, this is, you'll never be rid of poverty, but the goal is to get rid of poverty. Anyway, so we're supposed to, pursue that. So in other words, we have these basic concepts, biblically speaking. Charity from the New Testament, responsibility of the family all throughout the Bible. You have primary people, they're your primary responsibility. And then also the Old Testament focuses heavily on giving the poor job opportunities, but at the same time alongside with handouts. So I think that's something that we could kind of wrap our minds around if we're going to look at a biblical approach to socialized healthcare. Now, let's get into some more logical stuff. Not so much biblical stuff, but just basic logical reasoning, because I do want to talk about this. And it's not like logic is unbiblical. It's not like the Bible is illogical or something, and that God doesn't believe in logic. But just some fundamental logical concepts. So the first one I'll point out is that there's a false dilemma that's always tagged on to socialized healthcare or Obamacare or anything, that anyone who is in any way wanting to reduce government health care programs, reduce socialized health care, they are anti-charity. That's not necessarily the case. That's what's called a false dilemma. That's like saying, like if I told you, are you for stem cell research on aborted human fetuses, or are you against a cure for Parkinson's? Which is it? So it's a debating tactic. In other words, just because I don't support your way of helping the poor doesn't mean that I don't support helping the poor, or I don't support health care for the poor. So that's kind of ridiculous. Like, just because in other words, like, there are other ways to help the poor other than through Obamacare. You might have a different government health care program, or you might believe that private charities do a better job. So anyway, that's just a false dilemma, and it's upsetting when people just equate reduction of government health care to putting the poor under your boot. That's unfair. That's trick logic. That's not fair to go around saying that. Anyway, here's another one, and I want you to think about this one. And this is a really important one, as I jiggle the camera. This is a classic. I won't say where I got it from because it'll be a tip-off. It says, I'm just going to read it for you. It's right to give to charity. Therefore, charities have a right to your money. It's right to give to charity. Therefore, charities have a right to your money. So you see that? Okay, so you're probably upset if you're actually still watching this video right now. Then why would you say that? This is, in logic, this is called an equivocation fallacy. Equivocal. In other words, you say the same thing, but the word means a different thing. But you equate them because they're vocally equated. They sound the same. The word right, in one sense, sounds the same, but it has different meanings. So, another example might be if I was to say, Ravi Zacharias uses the example, he's a good tennis player. And so then someone says, well, I know this guy Roger Federer, and he said he was a good tennis player too, so you should play Ravi Zacharias because y'all are both good tennis players. And it's like, well, the word good, when Ravi uses it, is in a different context of who he plays, versus Roger Federer is in a very different context, as far as who he plays. So that's equivocal, or an equivocation fallacy. It's an equivocation. So, and that's what I'm doing here, with this. It's right to give to charity. Therefore, charities have a right to your money.
Alright guys, we're going to pick up where we left off as I ate a little bit of ice cream. So let's think about that equivocation fallacy. Is this a form of shoving your religion down someone's throat? In other words, if I was to say that I'm a Christian and I believe in charity and I'm the government and I'm the president or the whatever, so everyone has to give to charity because I say so. Well, what if someone doesn't believe in that religious belief of mine? Is that really right to force someone else to, agree with my belief structure? What if someone else has a completely different, religious objection to, they don't believe in what I believe in. For example, the Church of Satan doesn't believe in charity as a virtue. I wonder what they think about all this. Let's put it in a different spin. If I, as a Christian, believed in, that abortion was wrong and that people should be forced to keep their babies, I would be seen as shoving my religion down someone's throat. But then if I want to force everyone to, pay for a government health care program that's essentially force everyone to give to this charity, this government charity that I set up, then that's not forcing my religion down someone's throat. So do you see the hypocrisy on that? So I just wanted to give, some fundamental logic on that. Anyway, all right. Now, let's look at some practical economics. Some more, I guess, sort of scientific ideas. The first one is, do you trust the middleman? And it's something to think about when it comes to healthcare. Why is healthcare always handled through this middleman of insurance? Is that really a good idea? Is that really a good thing? Typically, we see middlemen as just someone who's getting a cut and not really providing any services. What services does this guy provide? So it's something to think about. With insurance, and then with Obamacare, you've got the government is a middleman that handles our interaction with the middlemen. We still don't interact with the doctor. But more importantly, I want to make a different point. So, I'm going to steal this from a guy named Dinesh D'Souza. And what he says is, what if everyone had catastrophic health insurance? What if Obamacare or government health care, whatever, was set up where everyone had catastrophic insurance? But the routine insurance, the routine visits, which, what does that count as? For example, I had an ingrown toenail, and I had to go to the doctor and pay $800 to get it removed. I had catastrophic insurance at the time. This was before Obamacare or any of that stuff existed. The catastrophic insurance was I live in the state of Georgia. I'm self-employed, so it was $320, I think, every quarter. It never covered anything, including my $800 ingrown toenail. I did go online and read about, what to do, and found out that I need to treat the infection first, and that saved me a lot of money because I was able to go right in there, and they were able to take my money, and I was able to get it taken care of. So anyway, here's the point. He says, what if we gave everyone $5,000 and said, here, this is for any of your routine stuff. This is for your eye exams and for your ingrown toenails and your prescription meds and your whatever. Here's $5,000. We're going to give everyone $5,000. You can spend this on your health care. If you don't, no biggie. What his point is how would that healthcare system work out? Now, a lot of people would probably respond to that by saying, you can't do that, you can't do that. People can't be trusted with that money. They won't spend it on their healthcare. They'll spend it on stupid stuff. So the question is, do you respect the poor enough to give them the dignity of choice? Just think, in other words, I'm just bringing up this example from D'Souza, and my point in bringing it up is just, it illuminates our attitude. Do we have an attitude that the government is the nobility and they know what's best for everyone else? So that's important to keep in mind. Now, the other point is, think about what the elimination of the middleman of insurance would do to health costs. If you could just go to whatever doctor you thought was the best deal, and if you didn't like what they were offering, then you just wouldn't go. What do you think that would do? How do you think that would change things? Understand what I'm saying? So, in other words, the idea is that would probably create a fundamental difference in the motivation from doctors to provide, cheap stuff or quality stuff at good prices. So anyway, that's just something to think about. In other words, it's a third party who pays them. You pay a third party, and then a third party pays them. Whereas if the doctor was being paid by the consumer, they probably would cater to the consumer. But right now, everything's catered to this gigantic third party. Anyway, there's some more important points we need to bring up. And this is really more of a Christian point. What we need is a moral change, not a legal change. If you can imagine the song Imagine by John Lennon. John Lennon wrote this song. Imagine all the people living for today. Just take that one line out of it. Well, let's imagine that. Let's imagine that we live in a world where everyone just, only is selfish. That's not really his point. His point didn't say everyone was necessarily going to be selfish, but I want you to springboard and just say people just live for the moment. They live for right now. They live for today. They live for their own selfish, egoist, me. In other words, what if we had a society where there were no rules, there was no government, and people just did what they wanted? What would happen? Well, people would be super, super selfish, super, super greedy, and things would get really, really out of control. I think we could all understand that. All right, now, I want you to take that and expand that out. Like, what if we had a society full of just... Imagine if we had a society full of just evil people. People who ripped off one another, who were liars, who were crooked, who were murderous, who were selfish and greedy in every conceivable way. And then we had this government that was like the most totalitarian government ever. It tried to fix everything. So let's say we had a government that was a totalitarian government, but not an evil totalitarian government, a totally super good one. And they made the best laws you've ever seen, and they were granted, they had maximum force to enforce them on the populace. But the population was totally evil. Do you think it would work? No. It won't work. It will not work. In other words, you cannot fix evil of society with rules, with government, with telling people what to do. It just doesn't work. So the simple concept is it's right there. You just can't fix society. In other words, the only hope for society is for people to be moral. We need a moral change, not a legal change. You can't, in other words, laws at the end of the day are a band-aid solution for the real problem is that people are evil and mankind is dark and does evil things. And you can't fix that with laws. You can't write enough laws to fix that problem. People have to stop being bad. So, we live in a world today where, we're talking about banning assault weapons. We were talking about that more in the past, But essentially, banning assault weapons is, what you're saying is, we don't trust our society, we have to create these rules. Well, how far do you want to go down that road of distrusting society, In other words, my point is that the direction we need to be moving is a direction where people are given greater freedom, greater ability to do what they want, and yet no one feels endangered, everyone's well taken care of, we're all safe. In other words, the best society would really be one where everyone had nuclear bombs and no one felt endangered in any way, so no one would need nuclear bombs. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, can you imagine if everybody in their backyard had a ballistic missile and could nuke someone, and nuclear war could just break out, and total super bad nuclear war could break out? Could you imagine a society like that? And yet Imagine if we lived in a society like that and we all felt totally safe. We need to be pushing for that. And so my idea as the role of government would be give people freedom in limited ways to allow them to expand that freedom. And essentially, just like raising a kid, you give them freedom, and when they handle it well enough, you give them more freedom. They're gonna blow it. They're gonna blow it. When you give people freedom, there's gonna be blowing it. So in other words, like where we are right now, with gun laws, it doesn't always go over so well. But for the most part, most people handle it all right. Handle that freedom, that responsibility okay. So when we feel like people are handling it well enough, then, they're being more mature, we give them more freedoms. Does that make sense? So that's my point is, the ideal society is one where people have the maximum amount of freedom and nothing goes wrong. And so we need to be pushing for that. And just because, we have problems with the amount of freedom that people have, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. I mean, that's just part of the process. When you give a teenager more freedom, they make mistakes. But that's part of how they, they're learning to deal with something that they never learned to deal with before. So anyway, all right. We could talk more about that, but we won't. Now, here's the other question when we get more to the economic side of things. Let's say that we had that moral change and that everyone in America is just wonderful and just believes in helping the poor and giving to charity, and we're all just wonderful people, and it'll be great. In that situation, should we have government health care? Should we socialize things? A lot of Christians argued in defense of public school in the early 1900s, and the argument was that this will eliminate crime. So, Christians were big on socializing stuff. So it's not necessarily unchristian to socialize things. But here's the thing. The question we need to ask is, the economic question, and we just need to be, what is the best way to help everyone? In other words, is the free market system of capitalism better, or is the larger cooperative system of socialism better? Which one works better? Now, people talk about, in history, and they compare different places, and, what the people in, essentially socialism is a failed experiment, and so what everyone argues is that, it wasn't really ever tried correctly, which is, I don't know, it's a moot point. We need to get, and sometimes people say, socialism works on paper, and it's like, if it works on paper, why doesn't it work in real life? Let's just see, does it really work on paper? So anyway, the idea behind socialism is essentially let's all put our money in one big pot, and we'll all combine it, and then everyone will be taken care of. Alright, so the problem with a cooperative effort is the larger it becomes, the more inefficient it becomes. Because now you're having to decide what everyone needs, whereas if people kept their own money, then they probably could figure out what they need for themselves. So that's essentially a fundamental little problem. Now, here's the other issue. The free market creates competition, and it creates fair pay for goods and services. In other words, let's say that you're working somewhere and you are being ripped off. Well, then what you can do is go work for someone else. In other words, if you're a good worker and you're awesome and you're getting ripped off and you should be making more, then you go work for someone else because some other guy would like to have you and he's willing to pay you a little bit more. So, in other words, let's say that your boss, makes $100,000 a year off your work, but he only pays you $20,000. Well, then somebody else is going to want to hire you, and he's going to want to pay you. I'll pay you $30,000, and he's still going to make the $100,000, but he'll pay you $30,000. All right. So the issue there is you're going to do that, and then you're going to go to the next guy, and you're going to go to the next guy until eventually you're going to go to whoever it's going to raise your pay. This system is going to raise your pay until you get paid what they can afford to pay you. In other words, under this system, it's essentially impossible for the rich to exploit the poor, unless the poor fall for something stupid. All right, that's the core concept of capitalism. So the thing is, the only way you can make it so that the rich can't exploit the poor is when the government comes in and creates some sort of control. In other words, like you use force. Like, well, you can't go work for that guy. As soon as you limit the free market, then what you do is you create an opportunity for someone to be exploited. As soon as this person can't leave and can't say, I'm out, this other job's better. As soon as there's some sort of legal restriction on people's freedom of movement, to go, do and work somewhere else, then it eliminates the protection of fair pay. Now think about the negatives of unfair pay, because everyone gets paid. We have a tendency to think in economics of there's rich people and they got all the money and the poor people do all the work. It's like, no, everyone works for everyone else. That's how it really is. We all do something to make money, and everybody does something, and we're all getting paid. We're all providing some sort of good or service or some sort of combination of both. Wealth in society is created by human technology, human effort, and human technology. Innovation, science, invention, creation, effort, work, determination creates wealth. So when you have unfair pay, that means someone is using their effort, their energy, their technology to provide something, and then they're not getting a return on that's fair for what they actually are doing. And so that creates a loss of wealth that was created and just got flushed down the toilet. So that's essentially a negative of unfair pay, because there's wealth that's being created in the society and it's just being flushed down the toilet. So because you weren't getting a payment that was equivalent to the proper value of what you created. So in other words, like if you build a bicycle and for some reason you get, it's worth $50, but you only get $25, then what happened to those other $25 of value that you created? They don't exist anymore. It's just lost. And so what could have been done with that other $25 of value? Well, you could have gone and bought something from someone else, and then that guy would have made money off his work. But now that just doesn't exist anymore. It just won't happen. Or you could have given it to help someone. You could have given it in charity. Not anymore, because it just doesn't exist anymore. So I think we understand that unfair pay can be, bad for anyone and everyone. It's bad. It's actually bad for everyone. So think about this. The free market is a form of democracy, because what you're doing is you're saying, if I don't like this, I'm going to try my luck somewhere else, some other way. So in other words, like, let's say that, the example I like to use is Coca-Cola in the 80s came out with New Coke. And they said they were real sure that New Coke tasted better and it was going to be this great new thing and everyone was going to drink that, and then nobody bought it. And so that is a democratic form of response that we don't want this product, and now Coke sells, or it says original taste. They called it Classic Coke for a long time, or Coke Classic. So here's the thing. The goods and services are moved to where people are spending more on them. So in other words, like, if everybody's buying X, they'll make a lot of X. And if nobody's buying Y, then they'll make less of Y. And so goods and services are moved to where people, want it. So in other words, if you compare in contrast with socialism, in socialism, what you do is you democratically elect people, and then those people determine where goods and services go. Whereas the free market system is a form of democracy because everyone votes with their little dollar. So you see how that works? So anyway, it's democratic. And also there's this question in socialism of like, does the guy in the government like know what you need? Anyway, now the problems with the free market is when there's I think we've talked about this before, is when there's a lack of fluidity and ability for people to move and go where things need to move and go. Because if there's unfair pay, then that's going to create a loss. Alright, now, a simple, obvious limitation of free market where you do want to limit it is you want the government to come in and say, alright, you can't steal and rob. You can't steal and rob. That's not a free market legit transaction. Because then people wouldn't be getting fair pay. So in other words, like, let's say that, you have a bicycle and this other guy over here wants your bicycle. He could steal it. Well, society is no better off overall because he stole your bicycle. But if he builds a bicycle, then now society as a whole has 2 bicycles. So the entire wealth of society as a whole has gone up. So that's the idea. In other words, for the free market to function, you have to have property rights. You have to have police, courts, and a system of enforcing property rights so that people will, get what's owed them from goods and services. All right. Now, I've talked a little bit about that, and I just thought I'd give a last little addendum here on sort of Obamacare and Affordable Care Act, AFA, and Trump Care. We're going to have Trump Care now, I guess. Specifics and sort of trick talk. So, one of the ones that comes up all the time is this question of pre-existing conditions. The Republicans want insurers to not be forced to accept pre-existing conditions. And then, I guess on the liberal side, they're like, the whole pre-existing conditions is something they champion, that like, this is great. People can't be denied coverage just because of pre-existing conditions. So they're championing this because their whole concept is charity is a good thing. It's good to give to charity. It's good to help the poor. But, therefore, their argument is, therefore charities have a right to your money. In other words, like, just because it's good to help the poor, it doesn't mean that it's good to force people to help the poor. And that's really the fundamental issue, that comes up with a lot of these. It's not the fundamental issue, but is it really right to force people to help the poor? It's good to give to charity, so we're gonna, shove our religious belief down your throat. Especially when you think about Satanists who don't believe that charity, do you think Satanists should be run out of the country and not have their freedom of religion to believe their own unique religious belief? Because they are anti-charity. They say that Christianity introduced charity and it's one of the worst things that happened to the world. And they believe that, like, you should be more powerful and take over and rule and run things. They don't believe in, like, killing and robbing and stealing, but they don't believe in helping the weak and the innocent and the poor. They don't believe in helping the victim. The victim, sucks for being a victim, which is largely what the world believed before Christianity came in and changed people's views on things. We live in a Christianized world today. We think that those Christian values are just common sense values. That's another point. But like, that is a form of shoving your religion down people's throat. And yeah, just because it's good to give to charity, it's not a question of, if you liberals love giving to charity, then like give to charity. Like, why do you believe that? Why are you advocating forcing everyone else to, do your thing? In other words, like, let's say that I go on a mission trip to Venezuela and help those people there. Odd choice of a country, because they're socialized. But anyway, let's say I go on a mission trip to Venezuela and help those people there. Does that mean that, like, I should, take a gun and go force everyone else to go on a mission trip to Venezuela because they're bad people because they didn't go too? You see how that works? Because that's essentially what we're talking about there. That, if someone should be forced to help, in other words, someone should be forced to give to charity. Now, let's keep going. Another big arguing point is that the American healthcare system doesn't work well. We have the most expensive healthcare system ever. And I've got 2 points I want to make about that. It's going to be my final point, but for right now, One point that is argued by people like Ron Paul is like that's because our healthcare system is already socialized, really, because of all the government regulations. In other words, this is just backdoor socialism. In other words, like, there's a lot of times where doctors would like to, provide medical treatment to someone, but they can't because they have to wait on the blood work. They have to do all this testing to make sure they can do X. And you begin to say, like, is this really necessary all the time? Or are the government protections too extreme? In other words, are we taking safety so seriously to the point that people can't even afford any health care because it has to be so carefully done to where people just can't even afford it at all? That's, to where there was that woman who, she's a billionaire now because she figured out a way to, for like $30, do a bunch of blood tests for people and save oodles of money on blood work, because blood work was becoming such a massive problem for people who weren't able to get treatments because they had to have tests to make sure that their treatment wasn't going to cause some random weirdo problem. And it's like, well, maybe the government's regulated healthcare too much. That's something to think about. I'm not going to come in here and say that it has. That's a more specific question for someone who, knows more about the healthcare industry. But there's one other point I want to make about that later. We'll get back to it. Another point that the liberals like to make is that, women were treated unfairly, and there shouldn't be different, healthcare costs for women. And I think that's ridiculous, simply because if the healthcare costs are legitimately dependent on the fact that women have very different health needs. In other words, pregnancy is really dangerous, and especially in the ancient world. It's not so much dangerous today, thank the Lord for that. But, so, in other words, in the ancient world, the average life expectancy of anyone who was just a normal person, not a rich person, was about 30. And for women, it was a little lower. That's not including infant mortality rates. That's just how long you were probably going to live. And so, pregnancy was so dangerous that women actually died sooner. Alright? So, I mean, there should be, women have very unique health needs. That's one of the, in other words, getting pregnant, having babies, and the different things that the female body does is just part of being a woman. In other words, like, men are far more likely to die on the job, but women are far more likely to die during pregnancy or have some sort of health risk or health need associated with pregnancy. And their health plans should reflect the fact that they're not the same as men. I mean, it's ridiculous. Okay, now this other one really bothers me. The argument is that Obamacare was created to provide health insurance to the uninsured poor, or they call them the working poor, which is a very trick way of putting it. In other words, we already had Medicaid for young poor people. They were already taken care of with a government plan that already existed for them. So we're not talking about impoverished poor people here. That's not what Obamacare was created for. We already had socialized health care in that sense. And then if the government is that involved in health care, you could see why they have so many regulations, because they're footing the bill. Anyway, we also already had Medicaid for elderly people. So who are the people that they're going to insure? Well, they claim that they were going to insure the self-employed or people who work for small companies that can't afford to provide insurance, and it was going to make it affordable for those people. Well, in my case, it didn't. I mean, I'm a self-employed landscaper. I was paying like $320 every 6 months for worthless, catastrophic insurance that never paid for anything ever. As in, I paid $1,000 deductible with 80/20 copay. So, if anything happened, I pay 80%. But like, it was ridiculous. It cost me $320 a quarter. And it was $1 million of coverage, and that's it. And I had to renew it, like, all the time. And they were always looking for excuses to go up or like take it away. All right. That's a lot of money to pay for insurance that I never use. For money I'm just mailing these people money and it's not for anything. And it went up under Obamacare. Now, the cheapest thing I can get is $220 a month for the same thing. I think it's slightly less coverage, slightly worse coverage, and it's $220 a month. This is ridiculous. Like, this is ridiculous. You know, I had the ingrown toenail. How did I deal with that? I literally walked around on the hurt toenail until I had saved up $800, and then I paid $800 to get it removed because I knew how much it would cost. Because I looked it up online, and I fix as many things as I can myself by looking up online. Like, I've had crazy rashes that I would have just gone to the doctor for, but I researched skin rashes, which if you Google image search skin rashes, be prepared to be grossed out and lose your appetite. But and I figured out, oh, that's what that is, and then I went to Walmart and found the stuff to treat it. You know, and I'm fine. You know, so I probably was more motivated to not go to the doctor for every little thing because I'm the one who has to pay for it. You know, and so the free market worked for me. In other words, the middleman of insurance means the guy who pays for it is not the guy who uses it. So I just go to if I had this super insurance coverage, then I would just go to the emergency room every time something happened to me for every little thing. And then the doctor would just charge whatever he wanted because, you know, he's not charging me. He's not going to lose business, you know, and it's just dealing with, it's dealing with this in-betweeny man. I don't know. Let's keep going. I don't know who these people are, the self-employed or the uninsured working poor. In other words, poor people who aren't in poverty, who have good jobs. But I was one of those people that didn't help me at all. So that just really, I find that really offensive because that's one of the things they tout as what's so great about Obamacare, and it literally took my health insurance away. I can't afford $220 a month for something that helps me zero. You know, let's see. People claim that it's the government's responsibility to help those who can't help themselves. That's the core concept of the left. It's the government's responsibility is to help those who can't help themselves. Now, the problem with that is that we're not talking about the government helping anyone. We're talking about everyone being forced to pay into a charity program. That's what we're talking about. You know, and so in my case, I was going to have to pay a lot of money for elderly people, and, you know, should I really be forced to do that? Or should I be fined for not doing that? Maybe they're not going to shoot me, but they're going to fine me if I don't do it. And if I don't pay the fine, then I probably will be looking at some sort of more severe punishment. And I do pay the fine. Alright, now here's the thing in defense of Obamacare is we sort of already had a system where a lot of uninsured people were getting health care. In other words, a lot of people were going to the emergency room and getting things done and getting taken care of. And then they couldn't pay for it, and it was just that's just that, you know, there was no money, no one could pay for it, and it was just done deal. But the bottom line is, people who have jobs as doctors and nurses and stuff like that, they tend to want to help people, and they're like, okay, this person is dying, or this person needs this bad, we're going to take care of this person, and then it's I can't pay, and it's oh, we'll see about that later, and it's there is no later. So, essentially, charity was going on for a lot of people, and what Obamacare, you can make an argument for it in the sense that what it's doing is it's documenting all of that and making all of that sort of unintentional charity work part of the system, so that we can kind of measure it and figure out where we're standing on that and get a more accurate idea of what's really going on. So yeah, there's that. One of the weirdest things about Obamacare is that it has increased unemployment. So employers were forced to provide insurance to their employees, and so this is not a debated thing. Everyone on the left and the right agrees. Like, a lot of companies have just fired people, and a lot of people have lost jobs. And what I read, one website, Congress budgets in 2014 predicted that Obamacare would cut the U.S. workforce by around 2.3 million workers by 2021. So, in other words, if we repeal Obamacare, it will mean a lot of people lose insurance, and they lose health care. But a lot of people would get jobs. So, in other words, like, what is a better system, really? Where people don't have a job and then they're on Medicare, or where people have a job but they don't have health insurance? Something to think about. Now, the final point I want to make in this incredibly long video is that maybe, just maybe, we're lucky that healthcare is so expensive. Have we ever thought about that? Because what's the alternative? In other words, like, when I was starting my business, there was a really fancy trailer, and I had a hard time deciding if I was going to buy it or not. Or should I buy the normal type of trailer? And I couldn't really make up my mind because I wasn't sure if it was really better and really what I needed. And then I looked up how much it cost, and I saw that there was no way I could afford it. And once I saw that, I thought, well, that sure made my life a lot simpler. I just can't afford this. So, no harm, no foul. I just can't do that. That life got real simple now. No more hard question about whether or not I should buy this. I can't afford this thing at all. Once upon a time, if you had a lot of diseases, you just died. Like, there was no health care for you. So in other words, health care costs and high health care costs are a byproduct of the fact that we have treatments. We have treatments for people. And so they say, well, U.S. health care costs are higher. Well, maybe U.S. health care has more treatments for people. Maybe we have more safety regulations too. Maybe those aren't bad things. We should at least consider the possibility that, like, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing that there's such healthcare is so expensive, because the alternative might be just dying. You know? So, that's something to think about. Anyway, I don't know if we're ever going to figure out how to fix everyone's ailments, but who knows, maybe one day we will.